Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank Liberty Mutual and IIF for organizing this. The thing that was really neat is I kind of feel like I'm with my peeps, where every single person, we're talking about things. I was like, wait, I talk about that too. And so, a couple of things for me is, I think the international angle is a critical one. Here at DOE, we focus more on the US, but I think we have a need to understand how do we actually connect into the opportunities in the international, and how does international inform what we're doing at the US? And so, Sonia, I actually have a follow-up with you on some of the things that we could think about on this. And then Nidhi, all the ROI stuff, I'm with you, which is to be proactive around all the different mechanisms around it. And the name of the game is how do we drive down risk? That is really important. And how do we get the capital markets comfortable with how we're doing it so we actually can get that to that transition? And then Chief Hoffer, you really set the stage, scared us first, but then came back, which is good. And you're asking us to think differently and really the intersection of the ecosystem. And you'll see the way in which right now in my role, I'm really trying hard to get the ecosystem connected and for us to think differently, transformatively. In terms of my background, I have a PhD just down the road, and it's in material science and engineering. And then I went from there to become a partner at McKinsey & Company, where I co-led the innovation practice. Left that to do my own startup as an angel investor, and now I'm teaching at Penn, really trying to transform how engineers think about commercialization, because we are taught to think very deeply about technology, but no one teaches us about how the entire real world works. And if we're going to be able to get technology to the market, we have to start at the source, which is how undergrads are trained. And that's kind of what I'm doing. And I got tapped to come here. And so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you is playing in those different ecosystems. There's several of us that come from the private sector, myself, Jigar Shah, David Crane, and we're infusing private sector thinking into the Department of Energy. And the reason why this is important is that if we are going to get the ecosystem to move, we need to know how the ecosystem makes decisions. And all of us have sat in boardroom meetings and others understand how capital allocation is happening. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you today is how do we manage risk? Right now is the most important time and disruptive time, quite frankly, for clean energy. Through CHIPS, Bill, and IRA, we have $500 billion that we can go towards the clean energy transition. And the key here is how to use that $500 billion to buy down risk so the $23 trillion that the private sector has can activate itself. So I'm going to share with you is how I'm thinking about risk, how I'm bringing the risk language into the Department of Energy and throughout. And since I'm a professor and a former McKinsey partner, I have slides. So hopefully those will go. Okay. So I think the first thing I wanted to share with all of you is what is the Office of Technology Transition? So we fondly call ourselves the otters. So I apparently really like water rodents because I went from a beaver to an otter. And the goal in our mission is to expand the commercial impact of the research investments department, and more importantly, to drive private sector uptake of clean energy technologies. I report to the Secretary of Energy, and I am the steward of commercialization at the Department of Energy. I would say before this administration, DOE was much more focused on research and development. We now have an undersecretary for infrastructure, which is really around demonstration deployment. So I think it's important to realize now we are trying to get things to market. And this is where I want to make sure we're on the same page on what is commercialization. And the way we define commercialization is going from research to development, demonstration to deployment. Anyone who's tried to commercialize anything knows this is not linear and it's really messy. You may do something, a demonstration like, oh my gosh, it doesn't work, have to go back to research. And so that's where the feedback loop comes in. But the goal is over time, when you get to full scale deployment, you've basically decreased the risks so that it can get to market. And across the RD&D continuum, what we're trying to do is decrease the risks, manage these risks so we can get the technology actually commercialized at scale. So what I want to share with you today are two things. One is a framework I've developed called Adoption Readiness Levels, ARLs, as a way to expand beyond the way in which we think about risk in the federal government. And then two, how we've applied these ARLs to get everyone on the same page on what we actually need to do to commercialize these clean energy technologies. So for those of you who come from the federal government, NASA had invented something called technology readiness levels. And for those of you who come from the private sector, this is very similar to technology stage gate processes, where the idea is when you get to TRL 9, that is when something can be commercialized. Now, anyone who's actually done commercialization knows we have to think beyond technology risk in order to get things to market. There are things like product market fit. right? You can create this great product, which is not solving a problem, and you're not going to be able to commercialize. Is there an actual desire for this? Do we even have a supply chain set up to actually manufacture this? Do we have workforce? We talked about this as being an issue. If we don't have the workforce that's there to install it, how do we get it done? Does the cost even make sense, right? Are consumers willing to pay the cost for this new technology? None of this stuff is captured in TRLs. And so what I've been trying to do is really get people to understand beyond technology, what are the risks that we have to overcome? Because if we don't pull the risk down for these, we cannot get to full-scale market deployment. And that is what these new adoption readiness levels are doing. It's a language to get people on the same page around what is required for adoption risks. There's basically 4 buckets that these adoption readiness levels are at. And you can actually find a paper that we wrote if you guys want to use this. This is open source, so I want everybody to be using this. The first is around value proposition. I'll go in a little bit what that is. Next is market acceptance. Third is resource maturity. And fourth is license to operate. And across these 4 buckets, we have 17 dimensions. Value proposition, things like delivered cost. You need something to be at a cost where the private sector actually can make money. It's actually pretty simple in trying to launch a new technology. There's 3 things you have to do. One is invent something that people need. 2 is be able to sell at a price that people can afford. And 3rd is deliver at a cost where you can make money. I know that sounds really simple. It's true for consumer products. It's true for clean energy, but it's actually kind of hard to do. Delivered cost is not something that a lot of technologists think about, and so it's important for us to put that there. Market acceptance, right? Is there, as an example, the ability for us to actually have the demand for it? If you look at hydrogen, is there a demand pull for it? Do we have the offtake agreements for us to get there? Do we have a value chain established to actually deliver the hydrogen as a result? Resource maturity is really important. It has to do with capital, it has to do with workforce, it has to do with all the different things that have to be there from a resource standpoint to actually bring your technology to market. And then lastly, it's license to operate. We've heard a lot about permitting and siting issues. Those have to be overcome. The policy environment, in some technologies, the community perception that this is a bad thing. So these are all kind of 17 areas, which oftentimes research engineers and technologists don't think about. So we pulled this together to at least get them thinking about this in a way to understand these risks have to be mitigated or addressed if we're going to be able to get to full-scale market deployment. And so what we've done is we've created a pretty simple tool, which you can download, where for every single one of these, we have a low, medium, high qualitative assessment, which you can literally read it on your own. You won't need to really be trained on it, but it's asking the question for your technology, for the product or solution that you have, is your risk low, medium, or high? So in the case of capital flow, right, the risk is low if there is a lot of institutional investors ready to put money against this. If we think about fusion 20 years ago, the risk was really high. Think about fusion now, everyone's clamoring to invest in it. So a lot of this will depend on the timing of what you're looking at. But by doing this, you may not know the answer, which is okay, but at least you have to find the answer. And then the question is, if my risk is high, what do I need to do to actually move it down to be lower? We then take all these 17 risks, that people have filled out, and this is where the art form comes. You use this tool to say, how many high risk dimensions do you have, and how many medium risk dimensions do you have? And then it translates it to an adoption readiness level score. TRL 9 is the best, which is you don't have any high risk dimensions or medium risk dimensions. And then you can see it pretty quickly falls off where it's hard to get even 8s and 7s. So the reason why is anyone who's been an investor, and I've been one, is it's easy to tell an investor 1 or 2 stories about your technology they have to overcome. As soon as you have to start getting to 3 or 4 stories, like, well, I don't have the workforce, I can't get the cost there, I'm not sure about regulatory and siting, they run away. So this is why it's important that we think people can explain 1 or 2 risks and how they're going to mitigate them. As it starts to get to more and more, it's much more challenging. But at least now there is a playbook for everyone to read and say, well, what are the risks that investors think about and how do I actually manage them? And so this is something that we are rolling out across all of DOE. And I feel like it went viral because we have a paper that you can find. And even a South Korea nuclear company was like, can you come teach us how to do this? Breakthrough, others are really interested on using this. And this is an open source tool. So if you want to use it, please send it out there. It's meant to help people to understand, especially technologists and researchers, what risk do you have to manage besides technology. And the way in which we use this is TRLs is kind of a little bit sacred at the federal government, and quite frankly, a lot of the private sector have stage gate processes, which are similar to TRLs. So we're using them in conjunction. We're not saying we don't need TRLs, we do, but we want to do it together. And we put it on a matrix where, on the y-axis is a TRL. So, if you're at TRL 9, it means that, you are ready to launch. If you're at ARL 9, it means you're ready to launch. So that means if you're in the top right quadrant, you're in deployment. If you move down in the lighter gray, that's demonstration, and you move down into the other gray, it's development, and then lightest gray is really research. And the way in which you use this is every bubble can represent the technology, and the bubble size can be the amount that's been invested. If you only work on TRLs, you are going to only manage from TRL 1 to 9. That is insufficient to get to deployment because there's all these other adoption risks you have to manage. And that's the reason why a lot of stage gate technology based institutions are enabled to commercialize because they haven't thought about the other adoption risks. And what we want to do is move progress towards deployment by moving up the adoption readiness levels by addressing these risks that we've outlined. So this is a tool, like I mentioned, that you can find. If you internet search OTT and ARL, there's a paper, these tools, PDFs that you guys can use. And we also will be developing some asynchronous videos over the next 4 to 6 months so people can be trained on it as well. But we really hope this is helpful for people to be using. Now, given this, one of the things that was really important was with all these equities that we've been given through these 3 bills, the laws now, the question is, how do we actually activate the ecosystem to bring things to market? And so it came to mind a couple of things, which I've seen in my career. One is Moore's Law. Moore's Law was trying to drive the number of transistors on a chip and double it every 2 years. And this was something Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, had come up with. He put that out as a goal. And then what Semitech did was they created a roadmap where they pulled an industry consortia of competitors who were part of the CMOS process. So people who grew silicon wafers, people who did plasma etching, all those folks got together and said, if we're going to get Moore's Law to happen, what do we need to do? And Semitech created a commercialization roadmap to say, here's the different steps we have to get to in order for us to meet this goal of doubling the number of transistors on a chip. And lo and behold, it worked. The other time, which Climate Chief Hoffer talked about, was the Manhattan Project, where we were able to catalyze a nation, right, to actually go do something big together. So kind of the inspiration for the work we were doing here was, how do I take the Semitech roadmap, add it to catalyzing a nation? And that is where we've gotten to this idea of these commercial liftoff reports, which I'm going to talk to you about, which is a roadmap to activate the nation to deploy clean energy. And I'm going to sound a little bit like QVC here, but go to liftoff.energy.gov. And I'm going to say that over and over again, because you really need to read these reports. They are a way to activate the ecosystem. So what are these reports? These reports are basically a source of data where we are actually agnostic to which technology wins, similar to a lot of what Nita and others were saying. We don't know what technology is going to win, especially like long duration energy storage. There's hundreds of technology pathways, and we also don't have a crystal ball. So a lot of the projections and data out there, we don't know if it's right. And anyone who's done commercialization knows that what I know now is wrong a year from now, even maybe 6 months from now, because as I'm innovating, I get new stuff. And so what we want to do is become a current and trusted source for data. And there is data in our liftoff reports where people are not agreeing, and we put the ranges there. We're like, nobody knows, this group thinks this group thinks that. So it's within this band, right? We also want to make sure we're leveraging the best of DOE, the national labs, and industry. I have 17 national labs that do a lot of amazing research. So how do we build on the existing work from the national labs and other groups that have really done a lot of the data thinking, so we're not recreating the wheel? And then lastly, we want to use this to mobilize the ecosystem. So we have been bringing people into the fold. These are also live reports. What do I mean by that? You're not going to go to 2023 DOE's hydrogen report. It doesn't exist. You're going to go to lift.energy.gov, and we are going to constantly be updating these things as we learn more. So even now with like inflation going up, we have to change our cost models. So there's things like that that are going to constantly be happening. And as we do demonstration projects from the private sector, we bring it in. So these liftoff reports are owned by all of us. We're just trying to assemble everything in a place where we can get on the same page. So I started these liftoff reports in September of last year, and we published 4 of them in March of this year. Now, anyone who's worked in the federal government knows that that is really fast. And this is why it's great to have a secretary who's my boss, who's very impatient. I'm very impatient. And she reminded me yesterday we have 409 days left to this administration. And it's also a way to show that this administration is wanting to be hungry. So we got this through White House concurrence and everything. And everyone's been amazed at these reports because they're real. We're talking about problems that prevent commercialization of hydrogen. We're not saying this is it. We put the money out there. You guys got to go. We're getting everyone together. So the first 4 that we launched were clean hydrogen, long duration energy storage, advanced nuclear, and carbon management. Those you can all read now and really understand what the pathways are. We are right now working on industrial decarbonization, which will have a cross-cutting overview, as well as a deep dive into refining and chemicals and cement. We also have VPPs, virtual power plants, one that we're working on. We also have a cross-cutting clean energy supply chain. And we're now thinking about the 3rd wave that will be going through. But when you read these, you'll see they're extremely comprehensive. We get down to the fact of, like in hydrogen, there are certain applications where this is in the money. It's not going to be in the money right now for consumer vehicles because electric vehicles is there. But light duty trucks, we should think about it. So it's getting to the analysis that a private sector company would be doing to figure out whether or not they would make the investment. We also talk about the cost curves and where things have to go. So it's really trying to get, and using the ARLs, using that language around where's the permitting risks, where's the supply chain risks. In the case of hydrogen, we have issues right now with the midstream and having that built so we can actually transport hydrogen. So those are the things we're trying to get ecosystem together to say, how are we going to solve this? Because there's not one single entity that can solve it. And this is a lot harder than solving the CMOS process. But I figured if we have these roadmaps that we all are agreeing to, then and if you don't agree with them, that's fine too. Tell me you don't agree with them, but let's at least get the dialogue going across the nation. And so a couple of key takeaways for the ones that are already there. So for clean hydrogen, we really need to go from less than 1 million metric tons in 2023 to about 10 million metric tons in 2030. And the near-term demand is going to come from existing end users like ammonia and trying to replace with carbon, to replace the carbon-intensive hydrogen. A lot of challenges we have is the offtake agreements, where right now people are waiting to get the supply chain set up before they're willing to guarantee a buy of the hydrogen, and then the supply chain doesn't want to set up until they have a guaranteed buy. So they're all looking at each other playing chicken, and we're like, let's try to move together. A lot of uncertainty on costs, on permitting, and so forth, but these are things that we have to tackle. In the case of long duration energy storage, the reason why this is important is if we're going to renewables, there's a lot of intermittency. When the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, we have to store the energy during that time. And so we analyze that's between 225 to 460 gigawatts of LDES is needed by 2060 to support the net zero transition. The key thing here is how do we drive the cost curve down, improve the performance, and also make sure that people are being compensated for having LDES. Right now, there's no business model out there where if I'm able to do long duration energy storage, how am I being compensated for the fact I built this to help with intermittency? On advanced nuclear, this has to be a part of the goals that we want to get to. The challenges are overrun risk and credibility, which is where all of you guys come in, which is how do we use insurance, right, as a vehicle to help with managing that? This is a thing that is really making advanced nuclear much more challenging. And then in the case of carbon management, this is really important. Currently, the US is the world leader. We have over 20 million tons per annum of annual capture, but we need to grow to about 400 to 1,800 million tons by 2050. We have a 45Q federal tax credit that's really going to help. But the challenges right now is a lot of the retrofits, the economics are not there. So private sector is not going to want to invest there. And there's a lot of other additional policy that's required to get this out the door. Each report is about 50 pages with about 50 pages of appendix, but they're actually pretty easy to read. And a lot of the figures we've had have been tweeted out because we're like, wow, I understand now what we have to do. So spend some time on it. And like I mentioned, it's at liftoff.energy.gov, if you guys don't remember that. I think Nita had asked us, what's one thing you're going to remember coming out of this? That's this website is number one thing. But I'm really excited about the work we're doing here, and I can't wait to think about more creative financing mechanisms that we can be doing across the sector between banks, green banks, foundations, insurance companies, because in the end, if we can't finance this energy transition, we're not going to get to the energy transition, which is why I'm trying to throw it out there. What's the risk? Let's buy down the risk and then get all of you activated. So with that, I think I have a few minutes for questions.
So I have a quick question. I know the Secretary mentioned national security, right? That security is an issue around energy and the climate transition. To what extent what you are doing, is that tied to maybe Department of Defense initiatives that might accelerate how some of this happens?
Yeah, it's interesting. Department of Defense is a very interesting agency because it's own customer, right? It can buy things, which we can't do at Department of Energy. So I think there are some places where you can think about the clean energy transition at a base or things like that, which could help to accelerate stuff. So I do think that this is an all hands on deck situation. When you think about labor, right? DOL is involved, EPA obviously is involved. So, any way that our sister agencies can help with this transition, everyone's on board with.
Hi, Dr. Chan. You had the subject about the advanced nuclear. That's very interesting. And so can you talk a little bit how you collaborate with the nuclear fusion? Earlier this year, they just have some breakthrough there.
So nuclear fusion is so exciting. I mean, who would have thunk it, right? Many years ago. That said, we are more focused in this report on what we can do with advanced nuclear outside of fusion. As those of us who are experimentalists, we know that what they were able to achieve was amazing, but the ability to commercialize that is probably 20 years out. So we're looking at things that can commercialize now, but there are work that's being done specifically on milestone-based development projects that's being led by Office of Science to get us further along the commercialization angle. But for me, I'm really focused on trying to hit the 2025, 2030 goals, and that's going to be hard with fusion right now. But trust me, I'm super excited about it. It's just I have a shorter time stamp than that.
Thank you. It's a great presentation. I just have to ask this question. As we're thinking about all the cost of in dealing with our distribution system here and dealing with the expansion of the broader grid that we need, we're really beginning to pivot back to what can we do on the demand side. And I'm curious, you mentioned a forthcoming paper on the virtual power plants. And I was curious if anybody is thinking about the relative cost comparison of, so much focus has been on just building out those systems, improving the grid, improving the distribution grids, all the infrastructure, the substations, et cetera. That's really expensive. It takes a lot of time. These kinds of technologies could potentially really reduce the need for those investments. So I'm wondering, in addition to looking at the technology, are there any sort of economic analyses of the benefits of maybe just having a more central focus on those kinds of demand side options?
Yeah, excellent question. And all of the work you'll find in Liftoff reports is very economically focused and economically focused at a kind of private sector level. And that's exactly why we came up with the virtual power plants as something that's important, because the capital investment required to transform the entire grid and the time is massive. So for example, here at OTT, we created the first vehicle to everything MOU, where the idea is, you are able to charge something at home at night, then you drive it somewhere and then it off charges to the grid, right? And so the question becomes, how do we create these little ecosystems which can allow us to have more of the transition to clean energy without overstraining the grid. So I think the key for all of this is we need it all. Like I've been kind of joking, people's like, what's your favorite one? I was like, it's like Pokemon, you got to catch them all. I mean, I'm not obsessed one over the other, and each is going to play a different role, right? So VPPs are going to play a critical role in certain applications, certain geographies when it's not possible to upgrade the grid, or they need to do it faster, or maybe they do it in the short term and then have a longer term for the grid upgrade. And so I think the thing I love about this is it's so complicated. This is such a hard problem to solve, which is why it's fun, because there's so many things that we can go after it. So the key for me is read all of these reports and the ones that are coming and think a little bit creatively around how do we activate these in a way where at the local level, right, because all this stuff is gonna be done at the local level, right? How do we actually get us to that transition? And that's why we were excited about VPPs, is we know that from a capital stack, the grid, revamping is going to take too long for all the stuff we have to do.
Hi, I was wondering, this is both state and federal question actually, but have you looked at procurement processes? Because if it's a new technology, sometimes there are no comparables, and often procurement requires comparables. And second, procurement sometimes defines a problem as tasks, as opposed to looking at the overall problem, which a new technology could solve, especially in construction. So I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, procurement has kind of a little bit of the bane of my existence as I've been in the federal government, just because it's like very complicated. And sometimes, as you're pointing out, procurement can actually lead versus strategy leading. So I think there's a need to understand what is and this is where we've been pretty good at communicating, what is it we're trying to achieve? And if you're actually trying to displace an incumbent technology or an incumbent thing that's currently being procured, the case has to be made why this new technology is critical and how you're going to get there. It is not trivial, but it is definitely something that can be a blocker in certain areas when the procurement process can be a little more convoluted.
So great presentation. You used the phrase, we need them all. So fossil fuels are very controversial in this country. What's the DOE's view on the future of fossil fuels?
So as someone who drives stick shift, and anyone else who does, is you can't release the clutch before you have to do it like this. Otherwise you stall the car. And that's the analogy I use for fossil fuels, right? We have to do a transition in a thoughtful way. If you pop the clutch, we're all gonna stall. So the question is, how do we, as quickly as possible, transfer over to the clean energy without stalling the car? And fossil fuels is going to have to be part of that equation because that's what we are using right now. So that's really the key for me, is that, and then the fossil fuels we do have to use, right? How do we do carbon sequestration, other things like that, to make it more environmentally friendly? So I'm a very pragmatic person. Hopefully you've heard this from this presentation as well as when you read the reports. So I'm much more around how do we do things as quickly as possible, but as sane as possible is the way I think about it.